Through most of its classical period, Greece was divided into a series of city-states. Most of this is because of Greece's geography. They were divided by mountains and seas, and so it was difficult to unite Greece into a single kingdom or empire. The Greek city-state was called the polis, and although there were many different polis in ancient Greece, they often followed a similar format. Greek city-states were built on top of hills. The center of the city, where there was usually a temple or fortress, was called the Acropolis, or high city. Beneath it, you had the agora, or the marketplace, which was sort of the center of community life. And then you had a wall which surrounded the more important and higher class buildings, and then outside of the wall you would have farms and villagers, and if the city was close to a sea, a port. A good example of an acropolis is the Acropolis of Athens, which still has most of its outer wall, as well as its temple, the Parthenon, and some of its other important cultural buildings there. These states weren't unified under a single government. They often had many different kinds of government. The oldest governments in Greece were monarchies, ruled by a king. You also had aristocracies develop. You have the aristocratic families that control the government. Now, in the classical period, a lot of these governments were overthrown by tyrants who ruled the government culture. Usually we associate tyrant as a bad word that means a dictator or somebody who seized power. But often tyrants were agents of change, and they were able to change those older styles of governance. Of the many different city-states of ancient Greece, there's two that became very famous that we want to focus on, and those are Athens and Sparta. And eventually these become the most powerful city-states in ancient Greece, and we want to see why. Athens, during its golden age, was led by a man named Pericles. Pericles came from a long line of leaders who gradually developed Athens' economy and political system into a democracy. And under Pericles, you really had the height of what we might consider democracy. All citizens were allowed to vote, although citizens in this case meant landowning men, rather than everybody else. The Athenian government was broken into three parts: the assembly, which is made up of all male citizens of age, the Council of 500, and the courts. The Council of 500 created legislation, and they sent it to the assembly to vote on. Now, what's interesting about the Council of 500 is to be a member of this council, you had to win a lottery. Essentially, every male citizen's name was put into a large pot, and they drew names every year. So everyone had to be well informed about the politics in ancient Athens. Democracy and equality was so important under Athenian law that if people were considered to be a threat to democracy, too popular, too powerful, then their name was written on a piece of pottery called an ostracon. And annually they would have a vote, and the one who had his name show up most often on these tiles was ostracized or banished from the city. So it was seen as a way to control Athens and keep it a democracy rather than let it fall into other hands. Athens was divided into three basic social classes. You had the demos, or the people, that was made up of landowning males of a certain age. And you also had slaves. Athens had a huge slave population. In fact, slaves nearly outnumbered citizens. Women were in Athenian society, but they didn't play much of a role outside of the house. They were expected to really control slaves at home, raise the children, and otherwise they couldn't do much. They couldn't even leave home without an escort. So Athenian society was not very equal between genders. Athens really prized education. Some of the oldest schools in Greece go back to Athens, as well as its most important philosophers, mathematicians. Athens also dominated trade in the region. Athenian coins could be found throughout Greece, and Athens had to rely on trade to import a lot of its grain. And even though they weren't very militant, Athens did have a very powerful navy, and enough people to support an army when necessary. Now, on the other hand, you have Sparta. Sparta was another city-state that became powerful but was very different from Athens. It started as a monarchy. That changed under Lycurgus, a figure who's sort of legendary, but he created the Spartan legal system and government structure. And another significant one was Leonidas, who led Sparta during the famous Persian Wars. The Spartan government was what we call an oligarchy. An oligarchy is a government ruled by a few people. In this case, you have two kings who always had to agree when they made decisions, so that there wouldn't be, one person having too much power. You had a council of elders, the Gerousia, who's made up of the two kings plus 28 other elected elders. And then the 5 ephors, or overseers. The ephors ran Sparta's military education system, as well as supervised the kings. It could actually arrest kings if they felt like it was necessary. Sparta did have an assembly of all male citizens over 30 years who were in the military, but really they only could agree or disagree with the decisions. They didn't have a whole lot of power, so really you only have a handful of people making the decisions in Sparta. Spartan society was also stratified between classes. You had Spartans at the top, who had the full rights and served in the military. The people immediately around the Spartans were called the neighbors, and these people also had to serve in the military but didn't have the same rights that Spartan citizens had. And then you had the conquered people, or helots. The helots were really very little better than slaves, and they were expected to do all the labor. Because there was a huge number of those people, since Sparta was a people who conquered their neighbors, the helots were often sort of feared, and so often there would actually be hunts against helots annually to ensure that they sort of knew their place, so to speak, and wouldn't revolt against the Spartans. Women in Sparta actually played a more prominent role. They still didn't serve in the military, but there was a belief among Spartans that a woman had to be strong and healthy and be able to hold her own if she expected to give birth to soldiers, which is what Sparta was known for. Famously, Spartan mothers would arm their children before they went off into battle, giving them their shields saying, "Come back with this or on this," meaning to come back victorious in battle or dead. So even though women didn't necessarily participate directly in the government, they did have a higher status than you would see in Athens. Sparta valued its own education system called the agoge, and in Sparta, boys from age 6 and up lived in the barracks with other soldiers. They were given very little food, very little clothing, expected to really forage for themselves, and train constantly. Men were only considered adults by age 30, but even once they had a family, they still lived in the barracks with their fellow soldiers. So it became a key part of Spartan society. Sparta otherwise was very isolated. No foreigners were allowed inside the city, and men were forbidden from studying things that wouldn't contribute directly to their success in combat or in government. So Sparta built its own, force by conquest rather than trade like Athens. So although there are very many city-states, by around 500 or so BC, Sparta and Athens were some of the most dominant, and Athens in particular had many colonies around the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea, particularly over here in Asia, and that will lead them to some conflict later with the Persians.